Welcome back, class. Now let's begin our conversation on William James, early U.S. psychology, and the anticipation of functionalism. So, early U.S. psychology can be broken up into four stages. Stage one, moral and mental philosophy. Here, psychology included topics such as ethics, divinity/religion, and philosophy. To learn psychology was to learn the accepted theology of the day. Samuel Johnson, influenced by Locke's an essay concerning human understanding, wrote a book which contained some topics which were psychological in nature: child psychology, the nature of consciousness, the nature of knowledge, introspection, and perception, all of which we've covered in some fashion in this course so far. In stage two, we have intellectual philosophy. Psychology became a separate discipline, became primarily influenced by the Scottish common sense views. Scottish school was a reaction to or against philosophers such as Hume, who maintained that nothing could be known with certainty and that moral and scientific laws were merely mental habits. Remember, we discussed him previously where he talked about such things as causation was nothing more than a habit. So the Scottish school took issue with this. The Scottish philosophers maintained that self-examination yields valid information and that morality is based on self-evident intuitions. Here, the idea is that intuition can have some value to it. The common sense philosophy had a clear implications for theology. The existence and nature of God need not be proved logically because one's personal feelings could be trusted on these matters because these are self-evident intuitions. With the respectability of the senses and feelings established per the Scottish view, textbooks written by the Scottish philosophers began to include such topics as perception, memory, imagination, language, attention, and thinking. In stage three, we had the U.S. Renaissance. Psychology becomes an empirical science. Here we're looking at the time frame of 1880s. Publishing of John Dewey's textbook, the first issue of the American Journal of Psychology around this time. James's publication of the Principles of Psychology in 1890. Here, psychology began emphasizing individual differences, adaptation to the environment, and practicality. Then we get to stage four, functionalism. Science, emphasis on the individual, and evolutionary theory combined into the school of functionalism. So far, we've talked a great deal about functionalism, so let's look at this a little bit more closely. We'll look at it more detailed in the next chapter, but for now, we're going to look at a preview of the characteristics of functional psychology. First, it was never seen as a well-defined school. It did not have one recognized leader or an agreed-upon methodology. There were common themes that ran through the work of those who called themselves functionalists. They were opposed to elementarism of structuralism. Their focus was to understand the function of the mind. The focus was not upon a description of its contents like we saw in structuralism, but the function was to aid the organism in adapting to its environment. So it was seen as a practical science. It wanted to be practical, very much different from what we saw with structuralism, which didn't care about practicality. So here we have this area of psychology endeavoring to be a practical science, to apply the findings to the improvement of the human condition. So when you have this practicality as part of the nature of this particular area of psychology, then if it's helping people and used as a tool in some regard, then you'll have a lot more people committed to it. So research on many participants. Participants included animals, children, and abnormal humans. Now note this. In structuralism, because they relied a great deal on introspection, there were certain things it could not do. It could not rely a great deal on animals' introspection because they don't have the ability to communicate to us, or even young children's introspection because of their lack of understanding and ability to communicate as well. So they urged the use of any methodology that was useful. Again, we see this practicality, this pragmatism, which is also a key function of functional psychology. So they were concerned for the why of mental processes. This led directly to an interest in motivation. We do certain mental processes. Why? What motivates us to do them? It accepted both the mental processes and behavior. So here we see this particular area of psychology was seen as legitimate to be interested in both the mental as well as the behavioral. These were two areas of legitimate interest for this type of psychology. It was also interested in individual differences. It was more interested in the differences between us as opposed to the similarities. So individual differences became a primary focus of this area. This functional psychology was influenced directly or indirectly by William James. In most psychology textbooks, we see William James as seen as the inventor or inaugurator, in a sense, of functional psychology or the school of functionalism. So here, William James influenced directly and or indirectly this area of psychology. William James was also strongly influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. And of course, we've already seen with the idea of adaptation to the environment as a key ingredient to the discussion that we had previously about evolution. So, William James's anticipation of functional psychology and pragmatism. First of all, he was considered an anticipator of functional psychology. He did not found functional psychology. He did, however, influence the movement of this area of psychology called functionalism. William James is from a very wealthy family. So he had a lot of things going his way. He's from a very famous family as well. His brother was a famous author, Henry James Jr., I believe. So he was from a well-known, famous, and wealthy family. He was educated all over the world. He had started off his career in some other areas. He wound up in psychology, but initially he was focused on chemistry, but the work was way too demanding for him. Okay, and then he also didn't pan out his area of biology. He could not tolerate the precise collection and the physical demands of field work that biology required. So chemistry didn't work out, biology didn't work out, and he wound up getting into psychology and philosophy. He was interested in learning from Helmholtz, that we've seen before, as well as Wilhelm Wundt, the founder or inaugurator of the academic discipline of psychology from the experimental psychology arena. So in 1875 to 76, he taught first course in psychology, the first experimental psychology course taught in the United States. In 1890, we see the Principles of Psychology, a 12-year effort, most influential psychology textbook of the time, appeared in 2 volumes, 28 chapters, and over 1,300 pages. In 1890s, he recognized as America's leading philosopher. In 1899, he had a great series of talks with teachers, which started the beginning of educational psychology and applying. Remember, this area, although he's not the founder of functional psychology, many of the ideas are still quite relevant. And so he was trying to apply these ideas of his in the classroom. So the principles of psychology per William James. The goal of psychology is the study of living people as they, wait for it, adapt to the environment. The study of living people as they adapt to an environment. So you can see a very strong influence here from the area of evolution. Also, what was the function of consciousness? From his perspective, consciousness is required for our survival. Why do we have all this mentality, all these cognitive things going on, this consciousness, this awareness of self and our environment? Because it helps with our survival. The emphasis on non-rational aspects of human nature too was also one of the things that he accomplished. He was focusing on things such as emotion or passion. So we've seen this happen before, where we had the Enlightenment era, where it was all about reason and rationality, and then we saw the backlash of the Romanticism period, where then they focused on the role of emotion and then passion and irrationality. So we see that here as well, that he is not divorcing himself from these ideas of emotion or passion. So he saw and believed that beliefs are determined by emotional factors. And we've seen this before as well. I believe it was with Hume, the idea that oftentimes it is our feelings that helps us to make decisions, and we may rationalize after the fact that give us some sort of logical reason for why we decided what we did. So here we see some support of that with William James, saying that yes, emotional factors do matter. They are important here when it comes to human nature. So the subject matter of psychology is consciousness. Phenomena is the subject matter of psychology and is to be found in immediate experience. Again, we've seen this pop up a time or two in recent conversations here. The immediate experience, the sensation, the experience, the conscious experience that one is having. The conditions here, things that are going on as this is happening, the importance of the body, especially the brain, and mental life. So he was examining the way consciousness is going to be structured or organized. From his perspective, seeing consciousness as being a very important aspect in aiding in our survival. So he was rebelling against the artificiality and narrowness of the Wundtian approach. Remember the Wundtian approach and others' approaches, it was sort of a reductionist to a degree, looking at the elements and things of that nature to build up things. Here, introspection does not show elements exist independently of the observer from this perspective. But what he sees is consciousness is the following. Consciousness is continuous flow, a stream of consciousness. Consciousness is a continuous flowing process, and that any attempt to reduce it to its elements distorts it. So if you can imagine a creek where you have running water, that is the consciousness flowing. And then if you try to break it down and channel it or whatever the case may be, you're interrupting the flow. So you are literally distorting your consciousness. So here he sees it as a continuous flowing process, always changing. Okay, and then from this consciousness we can select certain aspects to focus on. So we have this continual consciousness, this stream of consciousness going. Our environment, okay, as we're in our environment, remember our consciousness is our awareness of ourself and our environment. And so from that environment, we may focus on one aspect. We attend to that one aspect, selectively attending to it. So by doing this, it enables one to adapt to one's environment by allowing one to choose what to focus on. If there's something that is dangerous to you, you focus on it in that environment. So again, we see this idea of that we got from evolution, the idea that we use consciousness to help us adapt to our environment. That is the function. Again, functional psychology. That is the function of our consciousness, of our psychology, to help us and our survival. So this stream of consciousness is personal to the individual. So you have your own stream of consciousness and it's yours. It's continuous and cannot be divided up for analysis. It's just the way it is. It's always changing and it can be selective. Some events are selected for further consideration while others are not. Again, it's going to be usually those novel things, those things that may be important to the organism's survival. That's the implication here. And it's also functional. The purpose of this consciousness is to aid the individual in adapting to the environment. And when we talk about habits or instincts, They are formed as an activity is repeated. So as we continually repeat something, these become habitual or instinctual. All right, and he believed there was a neurophysiological explanation of these habit formations. So the notion is that underpinning all of this, there's something going on in the brain, a neurophysiological process that sort of underpins the idea of the forming of the habits as we are dealing with our environment, with our consciousness. We also see, as he mentioned previously, the notion of emotions and how important emotions are. Okay, that it's part of the whole human nature. So the theory of emotions. Before James, emotions preceded physical arousal or response. The idea is that we had the emotion and then we had the physical response to it. James changed that. He flipped it. For James, physical arousal or response precedes emotion. So the notion here is this: if there's no bodily change, if your heart is not racing, then you don't experience the emotion of fear. In essence, he's also communicating this possible idea is that when your heart is racing, beating really fast, you then may tag that bodily change as the emotion of fear. So the notion here, from his perspective, James is saying we have the physical arousal first, then we have the emotion, the experience of emotion. So this was one of the ideas about how he thought emotion could be developed within us. Lang also had this similar idea, and that's why you hear this particular theory usually referred to as the James Lang theory. Now, emotions are important. Now, from previous classes, you'll probably remember some of these ideas, is emotions help us to understand what's going around in our environment. We detect the emotions in others to figure out how it is that we may need to respond. If we see a bunch of people, let's say you're leaving the classroom and you see a bunch of people running down the hallway the opposite the way that you're going, you're running toward where they're running away from, and you're looking at their faces of horror and fear, you might want to turn around and go run or walk with them the same way that they're going, because you detect that emotion and that gives you valuable information about what it is as an organism you may need to do. So displaying as well as being able to interpret these emotions are going to be important for our survival. So in addition, we have this idea of self as part of consciousness too. So he looked at the components of the self: the material self, the body, family, and all things owned; social self, the self known by others, and you may have many social selves; the spiritual self, the state of consciousness, one's own subjective reality. So the self as the knower is the awareness of one's empirical self. The empirical self of each of us is all that he is tempted to call by name me. So he was very interested in this concept of self. And of course, we've talked about self a couple of times already. We saw that Hume believed that there was no impression of self, therefore it's somewhat of a meaningless term. So we don't see the same idea being presented here. In fact, James is using this as a springboard to some other ideas. For example, the idea of self-esteem. How do you judge yourself as a person of worth or not a person of worth? So with James, he was one of the first to examine this idea of self-esteem. So let's look at some of the methods of psychology that we see here. Some of the ideas too that are held by James. So we see at this point introspection is a basic tool and is less than perfect. Okay, we saw this being utilized quite a bit over in Europe, in particular with a form of it being used by Wundt and another form by Titchener. Then we see experimental method. All right, James did not use it much, but he acknowledged its use as a means to psychological knowledge, especially for psychophysics, which we saw with Gustav Fechner earlier. So Also, there was the comparative method, supplements introspection and experimentation, comparing methodologies or comparing organisms, how the animals do things compared to humans, and so on and so forth. He implied functional psychology is not to be restricted to a single technique. Don't do it. All right, and this would be a sort of good shout out and the ideas that Firebrand offered to us earlier in our course when he talked about pluralism. Okay, but the idea here is this is the notion of a pragmatist. Emphasize the value of pragmatism. We should not restrict ourselves to one particular single technique. All right, so he emphasized the value of pragmatism. A validity of an idea is its practical utility, its usefulness. Anything is true if it works. Anything is true if it works. So pragmatism is the cornerstone of functionalism. Okay? Behaviors, thoughts, or beliefs must be judged by their consequences. If it works for the individual, then it is appropriate. So in this regard, truth must be judged by its effectiveness in the situation. What works is true for that circumstance. So we see here this notion of pragmatism, which really sort of is a key idea associated with functionalism. So pragmatism was developed in the U.S. after the Civil War. And here in the U.S., we were no longer content merely to reflect European philosophy. We wanted a new approach for a new and vigorous young nation, the United States. So James shared the American distrust of purely theoretical or intellectual activity. And he asked the following, and this drove a lot of this idea of pragmatism. What is the point of theorizing? What difference does it make? Why is it important to bother with the mind games of theorists? So when it comes to pragmatism, a method for evaluating intellectual problems and a theory about the kinds of knowledge we are capable of acquiring. So for pragmatists, the starting point is this. Before determining if any given philosophical claim is true, James thought it first necessary to determine the cash value of the claim. The cash value of the claim. What is this cash value? Well, the cash value of our ideas is to be found in the use to which they can be put. Usefulness, a very pragmatic idea. So with regard to any theory, we can ask what difference it would make if I believed it, what consequences it would have for my behavior. If it would not make the slightest difference whether I believe the theory to be true, and it had no effect on my actions, my behavior at all, then the theory's cash value would be zero. In this case, the theory is useless. A very pragmatic view. This would be greatly supported by the Scottish philosophers of their common sense view of things. So for here, theories have to be useful, okay? Meaning that they have to have some sort of difference to be made if you believe it, that it would have some impact on your behavior. So theories ought to be judged then in terms of their success at helping us solve problems. You can see how this is a cornerstone of functionalism. Theories ought to be judged then in terms of their success at helping us solve problems. They are the instruments we use. Okay? Suppose you get lost in the woods and you use your knowledge of the sun's position, the direction you've been going, previous information about the terrain, etc., to develop a theory about how to find yourself again so that you can be no more lost. The cash value of your theory will be judged according to your success and avoiding becoming a midnight snack as you're wandering around bumbling in the woods at night. That's the idea. They are useful to us. That's the key thing when it comes to theories. a pragmatic perspective. So, a theory is true if it works. Traditional rationalist philosophers like Plato held that truth of ideas is not dependent on human experience. An idea is true or false whether anyone knows it or not. So there is an absolute truth. Now again, we did touch on this idea previously. I believe it was Kierkegaard earlier about truth being subjective. Okay, that truth has to be experienced. So this is sort of Plato here, but very much aligned with this pragmatic perspective. So James argued that the only meaningful way to gauge the truth of an idea is to see whether it works. Claims about absolute objective truth are meaningless, since they can never be proven by experience. So, wrapping this idea up, pragmatic truth. For a pragmatist, then, truth is something an idea has. It is something that happens. Excuse me, let me get that straight. For a pragmatist, then, truth isn't something an idea has. It isn't something that an idea has. It is something that happens to an idea. Before you discover whether an idea, theory, or belief works, it is neither true nor false. As you test out the theory or idea, it becomes true or false, or more true or less true. In other words, truth is not something static and unchangeable. It grows and develops with time.